The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the massive assembly hall at Camp Pendleton, casting harsh shadows across the faces of nearly 200 Marines seated in perfect formation. It was supposed to be a routine ceremony, another ribbon cutting, another speech from brass, another day in the regimented life of military service. But what happened next would echo through the halls of the Pentagon for years to come, becoming a story that would fundamentally change how the military handled sexual harassment and assault. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had served her country for 8 years. At 26, she was already recognized as one of the most promising non-commissioned officers in her unit. Her record was spotless: commendations for leadership, excellence in training, and an unwavering commitment to the core values of honor, courage, and commitment. She had deployed twice to Afghanistan, where she led supply convoys through some of the most dangerous terrain imaginable. Her fellow Marines respected her not just for her rank, but for her character. Maria came from a family with a long tradition of military service. Her grandfather had fought in World War II, landing on the beaches of Normandy. Her father served 2 tours in Vietnam. Her older brother was currently deployed with the Army Rangers. For the Rodriguez family, serving wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a sacred duty to protect the freedoms that so many took for granted. Growing up in East Los Angeles, Maria had faced her share of challenges. She was the first in her family to graduate from college, earning a degree in logistics management while serving in the Marine Corps Reserves. She had overcome poverty, discrimination, and the constant pressure to prove herself in a male-dominated environment. Every step of her career had been earned through blood, sweat, and an unshakable determination to succeed. But on this particular Tuesday morning in September, all of Maria's training, all of her experience, all of her carefully built reputation would be put to the ultimate test. The ceremony was meant to honor the achievements of her logistics unit, which had successfully completed a critical mission supporting humanitarian aid efforts in Southeast Asia. Admiral Charles Whitman, a 3-star flag officer with over 30 years of service, had flown in from Washington, D.C. specifically to present the unit with a meritorious commendation. Admiral Whitman was by all accounts a decorated officer with an impressive service record. He had commanded ships in the Persian Gulf, overseen major naval operations, and was being considered for a 4th star. His presence at the ceremony was considered a significant honor for the Marines at Camp Pendleton. The base commander had spent weeks preparing for the visit, ensuring every detail was perfect. As the ceremony began, Maria stood at attention with her fellow Marines. The ritual was familiar: the presentation of colors, the playing of the national anthem, the formal remarks from various officers. Admiral Whitman took the podium and delivered what seemed to be a standard speech about service, sacrifice, and the importance of logistics in modern military operations. But those who knew Admiral Whitman personally might have detected something different about him that day. There had been whispers in Washington circles, rumors that never quite made it into official reports, stories about inappropriate comments at officers' clubs, about behavior that pushed boundaries just far enough to make people uncomfortable, but not far enough to trigger formal complaints. The military's culture of hierarchy and chain of command often created situations where lower-ranking service members felt powerless to speak up against senior officers. The unwritten rule was clear: you don't challenge someone with stars on their collar unless you're prepared to face serious consequences for your career. This culture of silence had protected predators for decades, allowing them to operate with virtual impunity. Maria had heard some of these rumors, but like many service members, she had chosen to focus on her own duties and responsibilities. She believed in the system, trusted that good leaders would rise to the top, and that bad actors would eventually be held accountable. She was about to learn that sometimes the system fails, and individuals must choose between their safety and their principles. As Admiral Whitman concluded his remarks, the formal part of the ceremony transitioned into a more casual reception. This was standard protocol. an opportunity for the visiting dignitary to meet with service members, shake hands, and hear firsthand about their experiences. For most of the Marines present, this would be their only chance to interact with such a high-ranking officer. The reception line formed naturally, with Marines approaching the Admiral in order of rank. Maria, as a staff sergeant, would be among the middle group to be introduced. She straightened her dress blues, checked her ribbons one final time, and prepared for what should have been a routine, professional interaction. What she couldn't have known was that Admiral Whitman had already noticed her from across the room.
The reception hall buzzed with the controlled energy that characterized military gatherings. Marines moved with practiced precision, their dress blue uniforms immaculate, their bearing professional. The atmosphere was one of earned celebration. These men and women had distinguished themselves in service to their country, and today was their moment of recognition. Admiral Whitman worked his way through the receiving line with the practiced ease of a career officer accustomed to such events. He shook hands firmly, made appropriate small talk about hometowns and deployments, and posed for the occasional photograph with particularly distinguished service members. To the casual observer, everything appeared perfectly normal. But several Marines later recalled sensing something unsettling about the Admiral's demeanor. There was something in the way his eyes lingered a bit too long on certain service members, something about his smile that seemed more predatory than professional. Master Sergeant James Patterson, a 20-year veteran, would later testify that he noticed the Admiral paying particular attention to the female Marines in the unit. When Maria's turn came, she approached with the confident bearing that had earned her respect throughout her career. She snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, sir. It's an honor to meet you." Admiral Whitman returned the salute, but his eyes were already conducting an inappropriate assessment of the young Marine before him. "The honor is mine, Staff Sergeant. I've heard impressive things about your performance during the Southeast Asia operation." The conversation began professionally enough. Admiral Whitman asked about Maria's background, her experience in logistics, and her future career plans. Maria responded with the articulate confidence that had marked her entire military career. She spoke passionately about her work, about the importance of logistics in modern military operations, and about her commitment to the Corps. But as the conversation continued, Maria began to notice subtle changes in the Admiral's behavior. His questions became more personal. He stepped closer than military protocol required. His voice dropped to a more intimate tone. What started as professional interest was transforming into something far more inappropriate. "You know, Staff Sergeant," Admiral Whitman said, moving even closer, "officers like you are exactly what the Marine Corps needs in leadership positions. I'd be very interested in discussing some opportunities that might be available for someone with your attributes." Maria felt the first flutter of unease. The word attributes had been delivered with an unmistakable emphasis that had nothing to do with her military qualifications. She maintained her professional composure but took a small step backward, reestablishing appropriate distance. "Thank you, sir. I'm always interested in opportunities to better serve the Corps," she replied carefully, hoping to redirect the conversation back to professional matters. But Admiral Whitman wasn't deterred. If anything, her subtle attempt to create distance seemed to embolden him. He moved closer again, and this time his hand moved to her lower back, in what he might have claimed was a friendly gesture, but which crossed every boundary of appropriate professional conduct. Maria's training kicked in immediately. 8 years in the Marines had taught her to assess threats quickly and respond accordingly. The Admiral's touch was not accidental, not innocent, and not appropriate. She stepped away more decisively this time, her body language making clear that his advances were unwelcome. "Sir, I think there may be some confusion," she said firmly but quietly, attempting to give him an opportunity to correct his behavior without creating a scene. The Admiral's response revealed the true nature of his character. Instead of apologizing or backing down, he smiled in a way that made Maria's skin crawl. "No confusion at all, Staff Sergeant. I know exactly what I'm doing." The situation was escalating rapidly, and Maria found herself in an impossible position. She was surrounded by nearly 200 Marines, including many of her subordinates and superiors. The proper chain of command demanded respect for senior officers, but every instinct she possessed was screaming that she was in danger. Admiral Whitman's hand moved again, this time more boldly, more aggressively. He was testing her, pushing boundaries to see how far he could go before she would submit or break. He had likely done this before, counting on the military's culture of hierarchy and the reluctance of junior personnel to challenge senior leadership. But Admiral Whitman had made a critical miscalculation. He had chosen the wrong Marine to victimize. Maria Rodriguez had not survived 8 years in the Marines, including 2 combat deployments, by backing down from bullies. She had not earned the respect of her peers by allowing others to intimidate her. And she had not sworn an oath to defend her country, only to allow herself to be assaulted by someone who wore the same uniform. The moment Admiral Whitman's hand moved to an area that constituted clear sexual assault, Maria's military training took over completely. But it wasn't her logistics training that guided her response. It was the hand-to-hand combat instruction that every Marine receives, the same training that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds would reverberate through the military justice system for years to come. In one fluid motion, Maria grabbed Admiral Whitman's offending hand, twisted it in a way that her martial arts instructors had taught her, and applied precisely the right amount of pressure to neutralize a threat. The sound of the Admiral's radius bone snapping echoed through the suddenly silent reception hall like a gunshot.
The silence that followed was deafening. Nearly 200 Marines, who moments before had been engaged in casual conversation and celebration, now stood frozen in stunned disbelief. Admiral Charles Whitman, a 3-star flag officer with 3 decades of distinguished service, was on his knees, clutching his broken arm and crying out in pain. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood over him, her face a mask of professional composure despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. The first person to react was Captain Sarah Mitchell, the unit's executive officer. Captain Mitchell had been standing approximately 10 feet away when the incident occurred, close enough to witness the entire exchange. Her military training kicked in immediately, and she rushed to assess the situation while simultaneously trying to maintain order among the shocked Marines. "Medical personnel to the front, immediately," Captain Mitchell barked, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. 2 Navy corpsmen who had been attending the ceremony rushed forward to tend to Admiral Whitman's injury. The Admiral's face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought to maintain consciousness through what was obviously intense pain. Master Sergeant Patterson, the senior enlisted Marine present, began directing the other service members to maintain their positions while creating space for the medical personnel to work. His years of experience had taught him that, in crisis situations, the most important thing was to prevent chaos and maintain discipline while the situation was assessed and addressed. Maria remained standing exactly where she had been, her hands now at her sides, her bearing still professional despite the enormity of what had just transpired. She made no attempt to flee or hide. She showed no sign of panic or regret. To those who knew her well, she appeared exactly as she always did in high-stress situations, calm, focused, and ready to accept responsibility for her actions. Colonel Robert Harrison, the base commanding officer, had been in conversation with other senior officers when the incident occurred. The commotion drew his immediate attention, and he quickly made his way through the crowd to assess what had happened. When he saw Admiral Whitman on the ground receiving medical attention and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez standing nearby, his mind raced through the potential implications. Colonel Harrison was a career Marine with over 25 years of service. He had commanded troops in combat, overseen complex military operations, and dealt with every conceivable type of crisis. But this situation was unlike anything in his experience. A junior enlisted Marine had just physically assaulted and seriously injured a flag officer. The potential consequences were staggering. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Harrison said quietly, approaching Maria with measured steps, "I need you to come with me immediately." Maria nodded silently and followed the colonel toward a side exit. As they walked, she could hear the whispered conversations beginning among her fellow Marines. Some voices expressed shock and disbelief. Others seemed to be speculating about what could have possibly prompted such an extreme response. A few, those who knew Maria best, were already defending her actions, certain that she must have had compelling reasons for what she had done. The medical personnel had stabilized Admiral Whitman enough to transport him to the base hospital. As he was helped to his feet and assisted toward the exit, his eyes met Maria's for a brief moment. The look that passed between them spoke volumes. He knew exactly why his arm was broken, and she knew that he knew. Captain Mitchell was already on her radio, contacting base security and beginning the process of securing the scene. Every witness would need to be interviewed, every detail would need to be documented. The incident would trigger multiple investigations: military police, Naval Criminal Investigation Service, Inspector General, and likely congressional oversight given the senior rank of the injured officer. Word of the incident began to spread throughout the base with the speed that only military installations can achieve. Within hours, everyone from the newest recruit to the most senior leadership would know that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had broken Admiral Whitman's arm during what was supposed to be a routine ceremony. But the reasons for her actions would remain speculation until the official investigation began. Colonel Harrison escorted Maria to his office, where she was advised of her rights under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. She was informed that she was being placed in pre-trial confinement pending a full investigation. The charges she would potentially face were serious: assault on a superior commissioned officer, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and potentially others depending on what the investigation revealed. But Colonel Harrison was a student of human nature, and he had observed Maria Rodriguez's career closely over the past several years. He knew her to be a Marine of exceptional character, judgment, and self-control. The fact that she had resorted to physical violence suggested that something extraordinary had occurred. His immediate priority was to ensure that the investigation would be thorough and fair, regardless of the political pressures that were certain to follow. As Maria was processed into confinement, she was allowed to make one phone call. She called her parents in Los Angeles, knowing that they would soon hear about the incident through military channels or media coverage. Her father, himself a combat veteran, listened quietly as she briefly explained what had happened. "Mija," he said finally, using the Spanish endearment he had called her since childhood, "did you do the right thing?" "Yes, Papa," Maria replied without hesitation. "Then we'll stand by you no matter what comes next." That evening, as Maria sat in her cell at the base confinement facility, she reflected on the events of the day. She knew that her military career was likely over. She knew that she would face serious criminal charges. She knew that powerful people would try to destroy her reputation and credibility to protect their own interests. But she also knew that she had done exactly what her training, her values, and her oath as a Marine had required her to do.
The next 48 hours following the incident brought a whirlwind of activity that would reshape not only Maria's life, but the entire culture of how the military handled sexual assault cases. As dawn broke over Camp Pendleton, the base was already buzzing with activity as investigators from multiple agencies began converging on what was now being treated as a major incident with potentially far-reaching implications. Naval Criminal Investigative Service agent Rebecca Thompson arrived at the base at 0600 hours, having driven through the night from her office in San Diego. Agent Thompson was a 15-year veteran of NCIS with extensive experience in military sexual assault cases. She had seen too many situations where victims were silenced, intimidated, or punished for coming forward, while perpetrators escaped with minimal consequences. The preliminary briefing she had received about the Rodriguez case intrigued her. Rarely did victims of sexual assault fight back so decisively. The first priority was interviewing witnesses. Agent Thompson and her team began with the Marines who had been standing closest to the incident. Master Sergeant Patterson proved to be a crucial witness, having observed the entire interaction from its beginning. His account was detailed and damning for Admiral Whitman. "Agent Thompson," Patterson said during his recorded interview, "I've been in the Corps for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what that Admiral did. He was hunting her from the moment she approached him. The way he looked at her, the way he moved into her personal space, it was predatory behavior, plain and simple." Patterson went on to describe how Admiral Whitman had watched his hands wander during the conversation, how the Admiral had ignored Maria's obvious discomfort and attempts to maintain professional distance, and how the final assault had been deliberate and unmistakable. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez didn't attack a superior officer, Patterson concluded firmly. She defended herself against a sexual predator who happened to be wearing stars. Captain Mitchell's testimony corroborated Patterson's account in every detail. As an officer herself, she understood the enormous career risk Maria had taken by physically resisting a flag officer. No Marine would take such action unless they felt they had absolutely no other choice, Mitchell explained. The fact that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was willing to end her career rather than submit to assault tells you everything you need to know about what really happened. But perhaps the most compelling witness was Corporal Jennifer Hayes, a young Marine who had been standing in the reception line behind Maria. Hayes had watched the entire incident unfold and had immediately recognized what was happening because, as she tearfully revealed during her interview, Admiral Whitman had made similar advances toward her earlier in the reception. He whispered things in my ear. Sexual things. He told me I had a beautiful body and that he could make sure I got promoted quickly if I was friendly to him. I was too scared to say anything because he's an admiral, but when I saw what he was doing to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I knew she wasn't the first. Hayes' revelation transformed the investigation from a simple assault case into something much larger. Agent Thompson immediately expanded her inquiry to determine if there were other victims and to examine Admiral Whitman's pattern of behavior throughout his career. What she found was deeply disturbing. Phone calls to Admiral Whitman's previous commands revealed a troubling pattern of complaints that had been dismissed, transferred, or buried in bureaucratic red tape. Junior officers spoke anonymously about inappropriate advances, unwanted touching, and quid pro quo propositions. Several female service members had requested transfers from units under Whitman's command, citing personality conflicts or career development opportunities rather than risk the career suicide of filing formal sexual harassment complaints. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The investigation also revealed that Admiral Whitman had a history of targeting strong, accomplished women who posed a threat to his control. A Navy lieutenant from his previous command described how Whitman had systematically undermined her career after she rebuffed his advances, eventually forcing her to leave the service entirely. A Coast Guard captain reported similar treatment, noting that Whitman seemed particularly focused on breaking down women who wouldn't submit to his authority. Meanwhile, Maria remained in confinement, but her case was generating unprecedented attention. News of the incident had leaked to the media, and story after story began appearing about the Marine who had broken an admiral's arm. Initially, the coverage was largely negative, portraying Maria as an unstable service member who had attacked a decorated war hero. But as more details emerged through Agent Thompson's investigation, the narrative began to shift. Military advocacy groups started paying attention, congressional representatives began asking questions. Most importantly, other victims of military sexual assault began to see Maria's story as a symbol of resistance against a system that had failed to protect them. Maria's legal representation came in the form of Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Martinez, a Marine Corps attorney with extensive experience in military justice cases. Martinez had volunteered to represent Maria after reading the preliminary investigation reports, recognizing that this case could set crucial precedents for how the military handled sexual assault cases in the future. During their first meeting in the base legal offices, Martinez was struck by Maria's composure and clarity about what had happened. She said, "You need to understand that the military justice system is designed to protect the institution first, individual second. They're going to try to make an example of you to discourage others from taking similar action." Maria's response was immediate and unwavering. "Ma'am, I didn't break that admiral's arm to make a statement or set a precedent. I broke it because he was sexually assaulting me, and my training taught me to neutralize threats. If that makes me an example, so be it."
Lieutenant Colonel Martinez knew she was facing the most challenging case of her career. The military justice system had historically been reluctant to side with enlisted personnel against flag officers, particularly in cases involving allegations of sexual misconduct. The institutional pressure to protect senior leadership was enormous, and Maria's case threatened to expose decades of systemic failures in addressing sexual assault within the ranks. Martinez's first strategy session with her legal team lasted well into the night. They knew that Admiral Whitman's lawyers would portray Maria as an unstable, violent Marine who had attacked a decorated officer without provocation. They would argue that even if the Admiral had made inappropriate comments, physical violence was never justified against a superior officer. They would claim that Maria had overreacted to innocent gestures and had seriously injured a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. But Martinez had something that Admiral Whitman's defense team didn't expect: the truth, supported by an increasingly comprehensive body of evidence. Agent Thompson's investigation had uncovered not just the incidents at Camp Pendleton, but a pattern of predatory behavior spanning Admiral Whitman's entire career. More victims were coming forward daily, emboldened by Maria's courage to fight back. The defense strategy Martinez developed was groundbreaking in its approach. Rather than simply arguing that Maria had acted in self-defense, she planned to demonstrate that Admiral Whitman's behavior constituted a clear and present danger that Maria was duty-bound to resist. She would argue that Maria's actions upheld the highest ideals of the Marine Corps, while Admiral Whitman had violated everything the uniform represented. Martinez's team began gathering character witnesses for Maria: Marines who had served with her in Afghanistan, superior officers who had relied on her leadership in critical situations, and fellow service members who could testify to her exemplary conduct throughout her career. The picture that emerged was of a Marine who had never shown any tendency toward violence, except when defending herself or others from legitimate threats. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen had served with Maria during her second deployment to Afghanistan. During his deposition, he described an incident where Maria had risked her own life to evacuate wounded civilians from a market bombing. She carried a bleeding child for 2 miles through hostile territory, Chen testified. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is the kind of Marine who runs toward danger when others are threatened. She's also the kind of Marine who would never use violence unnecessarily. First Lieutenant Michael Torres had been Maria's platoon leader during her first deployment. He described her as the most level-headed Marine I've ever served with, and recalled how she had de-escalated potentially violent confrontations with local civilians on multiple occasions. If Maria Rodriguez resorted to physical force, it was because she had exhausted every other option, Torres stated firmly. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from General Patricia Williams, a 2-star Marine Corps general who had mentored Maria earlier in her career. General Williams was one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Marines and had faced her own share of harassment and discrimination during her rise through the ranks. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez represents everything we want in a Marine, General Williams testified via video conference from her current assignment in Japan. She embodies honor, courage, and commitment, not just in words, but in actions. If she felt compelled to physically defend herself against sexual assault, then I have no doubt that she faced a genuine threat that left her no alternative. General Williams's support was crucial not just for Maria's defense, but for the broader implications of the case. Her testimony made clear that this wasn't just about one incident between 2 individuals. It was about the fundamental question of whether the military would protect victims of sexual assault or continue to prioritize institutional protection over justice. Meanwhile, Admiral Whitman's legal team was facing their own challenges. Led by Captain David Morrison, a Navy attorney with extensive experience defending senior officers, they had initially expected to present a straightforward case of assault on a superior officer. But as Agent Thompson's investigation continued to reveal damaging information about Whitman's conduct, their strategy became increasingly defensive. Captain Morrison's team tried to argue that Admiral Whitman's previous behavior was irrelevant to the specific incident at Camp Pendleton. They claimed that Maria had overreacted to what they described as innocent social interaction and had used excessive force against a man who posed no real threat to her. They emphasized Admiral Whitman's distinguished service record and argued that his reputation shouldn't be destroyed by unproven allegations. However, their defense was severely undermined when Agent Thompson uncovered documentary evidence of Admiral Whitman's misconduct. Several victims had kept detailed journals of their experiences, including dates, times, and specific details of inappropriate advances. Others had reported incidents to chaplains or military counselors, creating a paper trail that supported their allegations. The most damaging evidence came from Admiral Whitman's own service records. A careful review revealed a pattern of female personnel requesting transfers from his commands at rates significantly higher than the military average. Exit interviews, previously buried in bureaucratic files, contained veiled references to leadership issues and inappropriate behavior that took on new significance in light of the current allegations. Perhaps most devastating of all was the discovery of a complaint filed against Admiral Whitman early in his career that had been dismissed without investigation. The complaint, filed by a young Navy ensign, described behavior almost identical to what Maria had experienced: inappropriate touching, sexual propositions, and threats of career retaliation for non-compliance. As the evidence mounted, Captain Morrison realized that his client's case was becoming increasingly untenable. Admiral Whitman was not the victim of an unprovoked assault. He was a serial predator who had finally encountered someone willing and able to fight back.
As winter approached Camp Pendleton, the anticipation surrounding United States versus Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had reached a fever pitch. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward case of assault on a superior officer had evolved into a landmark court-martial that would test the very foundations of military justice and the military's commitment to addressing sexual assault within its ranks. The base had been transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the streets outside the main gate, reporters from major networks camped out at local hotels, and congressional representatives announced their intention to personally observe the proceedings. The case had captured national attention, not just because of its dramatic circumstances, but because it represented a potential turning point in how the military handled sexual assault cases. Maria had been released from pre-trial confinement after Lieutenant Colonel Martinez successfully argued that she posed no flight risk and had acted in self-defense. She was restricted to base and required to report to the duty officer twice daily, but she was able to participate more fully in her defense preparation. The time she spent working with Martinez and her legal team was intensive, often lasting 12 hours a day as they prepared for every possible angle of attack from the prosecution. The prosecution team, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Bradley, faced enormous pressure from senior military leadership to secure a conviction. Bradley was a career military lawyer with an impeccable record and a reputation for thorough preparation. He understood that the military's credibility was on the line. If Maria was acquitted, it would send a message that enlisted personnel could physically assault flag officers with impunity, potentially undermining military discipline and order. But Bradley also understood that he was fighting an increasingly uphill battle. Agent Thompson's investigation had continued to uncover disturbing evidence about Admiral Whitman's conduct, and new victims were coming forward almost daily. The Admiral, meanwhile, had been quietly reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon pending the resolution of the case, a move that many interpreted as an attempt to minimize further damage to his reputation and the Navy's image. The victim impact statements were particularly powerful. Lieutenant Sarah Anderson, who had served under Admiral Whitman's command 2 years earlier, described how his sexual harassment had destroyed her confidence and ultimately driven her to leave the military entirely. "I became a naval officer to serve my country. Instead, I spent 2 years being hunted by a predator who used his rank and authority to victimize junior personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez did what I wished I had been brave enough to do. She fought back." Commander Lisa Parker, now retired, described how Admiral Whitman had systematically undermined her career after she rejected his advances. "He destroyed my reputation through whisper campaigns and negative fitness reports. He made it clear that women in his command had two choices: submit to his advances or have their careers ended. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez chose a third option. She defended herself." The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Corporal Jennifer Hayes, who had witnessed the assault at Camp Pendleton. During her pre-trial deposition, Hayes broke down as she described her own encounter with Admiral Whitman earlier that same day. "He told me that my career depended on being cooperative," she sobbed. "When I saw what he was doing to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I knew she was fighting for all of us." Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's defense strategy was becoming clearer as the trial date approached. She would argue that Maria had not only acted in lawful self-defense, but had also upheld her oath as a Marine to protect others from harm. Martinez planned to demonstrate that Admiral Whitman's conduct represented a clear violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and that Maria's response was proportional to the threat she faced. The defense team had also uncovered evidence that Admiral Whitman's pattern of behavior was not only known to senior leadership, but had been actively concealed to protect his career and the Navy's image. Internal memos revealed that complaints against Whitman had been dismissed or buried, and that victims had been discouraged from coming forward through both subtle and overt intimidation. One particularly damaging document was a letter from Admiral Whitman's former commanding officer recommending him for promotion despite, quote, concerns about his interaction with female personnel. The letter noted that Whitman was occasionally overly familiar with women under his command, but argued that his technical competence outweighed these, quote, minor personality quirks. Martinez planned to use this evidence to argue that the military's failure to address Admiral Whitman's conduct had created the very situation that led to Maria's necessary use of force. She would contend that if the system had worked as designed, Admiral Whitman would have been held accountable years earlier, and Maria would never have been placed in a position where she needed to defend herself. The media attention surrounding the case had also attracted the support of numerous veterans organizations and women's rights groups. The Marine Corps League, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and several other prominent military associations had issued statements supporting Maria's right to defend herself against sexual assault. Several retired general officers had publicly stated that they believed Maria had acted appropriately under the circumstances. However, the case also had its detractors. Some retired military leaders argued that Maria's actions, regardless of provocation, undermined military discipline and set a dangerous precedent. They contended that there were proper channels for addressing sexual harassment and that violence was never an appropriate response to inappropriate behavior from a superior officer. As the court-martial date approached, both sides knew that the outcome would have implications far beyond Maria's individual case. If she was convicted, it would send a clear message to sexual assault victims in the military that fighting back was not an option, and that the system would always protect senior leadership over junior personnel. If she was acquitted, it would represent a fundamental shift in how the military viewed self-defense against sexual assault. Maria herself remained focused on the simple truth that had guided her actions from the beginning. She had defended herself against a sexual predator, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences resulted from that decision.
The morning of January 15th dawned clear and cold over Camp Pendleton. Inside Courtroom A of the Base Legal Center, military justice was about to be tested in ways it had never been before. The gallery was packed with Marines, naval personnel, media representatives, and civilian observers who had traveled from across the country to witness what many were calling the most important military sexual assault case in decades. Colonel Sarah Henderson, the military judge presiding over the court-martial, had spent weeks preparing for this moment. A 23-year veteran of the Marine Corps with extensive experience in military law, Colonel Henderson understood that her decisions would be scrutinized not just by the immediate participants, but by Congress, the Pentagon, and the American public. She was determined to ensure that the proceedings would be conducted fairly in according to military law, regardless of the political pressures surrounding the case. The members of the court-martial panel, the military equivalent of a jury, had been carefully selected through the standard military justice process. The panel consisted of 5 officers and 2 senior enlisted Marines, all of whom had been screened to ensure they had no prior knowledge of the case beyond what had appeared in media coverage. Colonel Martinez had fought hard to include enlisted personnel on the panel, arguing that Maria's peers should have a voice in determining her fate. As Maria entered the courtroom in her dress blue uniform, she walked with the same confident bearing that had characterized her entire military career. She had spent the previous evening with her family, who had flown in from Los Angeles to support her during the trial. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had reminded her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing despite being afraid.
The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Bradley, painted Maria as a dangerous Marine who had lost control and seriously injured a superior officer. Bradley argued that regardless of whatever inappropriate comments Admiral Whitman might have made, physical violence was never justified, and that Maria's response was grossly disproportionate to any perceived threat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the panel," Bradley began, his voice carrying the authority of years in military courtrooms, "we are here because Staff Sergeant Rodriguez chose violence over discipline. She chose to take the law into her own hands rather than trust in the military justice system. No matter what words may have been spoken, no matter what gestures may have been made, nothing justifies the deliberate breaking of a superior officer's arm." Bradley emphasized Admiral Whitman's distinguished service record, his decorations for valor, and his 30 decades of dedication to the Navy. He portrayed the Admiral as a victim of an unprovoked assault who had been permanently injured by a subordinate who had failed to maintain military discipline. The prosecution's strategy was clear: focus on Maria's actions while minimizing discussion of what had prompted them. But when Lieutenant Colonel Martinez rose to deliver her opening statement, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Martinez had prepared for this moment for months, and she knew that her opening words would set the tone for Maria's defense. "Members of the panel," Martinez began, her voice steady and clear, "Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez did not assault a superior officer. She defended herself against a sexual predator who was using his rank and authority to commit a crime. The evidence will show that Admiral Charles Whitman is not the decorated hero the prosecution would have you believe. He is a serial sexual predator who has victimized female service members for decades." Martinez outlined the evidence that would be presented, the pattern of complaints against Admiral Whitman that had been ignored or buried, the testimony of multiple victims who had suffered under his command, and the eyewitness accounts of what actually happened during that ceremony at Camp Pendleton. The prosecution wants you to believe that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez overreacted to innocent behavior, but the evidence will show that she faced a clear and immediate threat of sexual assault from a man who is using his position of authority to commit countless other women. She did exactly what her training taught her to do. She neutralized a threat to protect herself and, by extension, every other female service member who might have become Admiral Whitman's next victim. The first witness called by the prosecution was Captain Robert Stevens, the base medical officer who had treated Admiral Whitman's injuries. Stevens testified about the severity of the fracture, a clean break of the radius bone that required surgical repair and would likely cause permanent limitation of mobility in the Admiral's right arm. Under cross-examination, however, Martinez established that the injury was consistent with a defensive maneuver designed to break an attacker's grip, rather than an offensive assault intended to cause maximum damage. Stevens admitted that the fracture pattern suggested that Maria had used precisely the minimum force necessary to free herself from Admiral Whitman's grasp. The prosecution then called several character witnesses for Admiral Whitman, including former subordinates who testified to his leadership abilities and professional competence. But Martinez's cross-examinations revealed that most of these witnesses were male officers who acknowledged they had no knowledge of how Admiral Whitman interacted with female personnel. When Martinez asked one witness, Commander David Walsh, whether he had ever observed Admiral Whitman's behavior toward women, Walsh's response was telling. "I wouldn't really know, ma'am. I never paid attention to how the Admiral talked to the ladies." The prosecution's case continued for 3 days, with testimony about military protocol, chain of command, and the importance of maintaining discipline within the ranks. But each witness who testified about the severity of Maria's supposed offense was systematically undermined by Martinez's careful cross-examination, which revealed the witness's lack of knowledge about the circumstances that had prompted Maria's actions. The turning point came when the prosecution called Admiral Whitman himself to testify. Despite his lawyer's objections, Whitman had insisted on taking the stand, confident that his rank and reputation would carry the day. It was a decision that would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Admiral Charles Whitman entered the courtroom with the bearing of a man accustomed to deference and respect. Despite the sling supporting his still healing right arm, he walked with military precision to the witness stand, where he raised his left hand to take the oath.
To many observers, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a distinguished naval officer who had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley began his direct examination by walking Admiral Whitman through his impressive service record. 32 years of naval service, command of multiple ships, participation in major military operations from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific. The Admiral spoke confidently about his dedication to the Navy and his pride in serving his country. "Admiral Whitman," Bradley asked, "can you describe for the court what happened during your interaction with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez at Camp Pendleton?" Whitman's version of events painted him as the victim of an inexplicable attack. According to his testimony, he had been engaged in routine professional conversation with Maria when she suddenly, and without warning, grabbed his arm and twisted it until it broke. He claimed that he had done nothing more than shake her hand and perhaps place a friendly hand on her back in what he described as normal social interaction. "I was completely shocked by her response," Whitman testified, his voice carrying a tone of wounded dignity. "I had been nothing but professional and respectful. Her reaction was completely out of proportion to anything that had occurred during our conversation." Bradley asked Whitman about the allegations that had emerged during the investigation, the claims by multiple women that he had sexually harassed them during his career. Whitman denied all of the allegations, characterizing them as either misunderstandings or attempts by disgruntled former subordinates to damage his reputation. "These allegations are painful and false," Whitman said, looking directly at the members of the court-martial panel. "I have always treated all personnel under my command with respect and professionalism. I believe these accusations have emerged only because of the publicity surrounding this case." But when Lieutenant Colonel Martinez rose to begin her cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed dramatically. Martinez had spent months preparing for this moment, and she had Admiral Whitman exactly where she wanted him, under oath and committed to his version of events. Martinez began methodically, establishing the timeline of events at Camp Pendleton and getting Whitman to confirm details of his conversation with Maria. She asked about his movements, his hand placement, and his words. Whitman remained confident, sticking to his story that everything had been professional and appropriate. Then Martinez began introducing evidence that Whitman's lawyers had hoped would never see the light of day. "Admiral Whitman," Martinez said, holding up a personnel file, "are you familiar with Lieutenant Junior Grade Rebecca Foster?" Whitman's composure faltered slightly. "The name sounds familiar, but I can't place her specifically." "Let me help refresh your memory," Martinez continued. "Lieutenant Foster served under your command aboard the USS Constellation in 2018. Does that help?" As Martinez read from Foster's personnel file, including her original stellar fitness reports, followed by increasingly negative evaluations after she had rebuffed Whitman's advances, the Admiral's denials became less convincing. When Martinez produced Foster's original complaint, filed with the ship's chaplain, detailing Whitman's inappropriate behavior, his testimony began to unravel. "I don't recall this specific incident," but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Martinez continued her methodical destruction of Whitman's credibility. She introduced evidence of complaint after complaint, each following the same pattern. Promising young female officers whose careers had been destroyed after they refused Whitman's advances. The Admiral's explanations became increasingly weak as Martinez presented a paper trail spanning over a decade. The most damaging moment came when Martinez confronted Whitman with a recording that Agent Thompson had uncovered during her investigation. The recording, made by Ensign Patricia Mills during a one-on-one meeting with Whitman in the stateroom, captured him making explicit sexual propositions and threatening her career if she didn't comply. As Whitman's own voice filled the courtroom, "Your fitness reports depend on how cooperative you're willing to be, Ensign," his facade of professional dignity crumbled completely. The members of the court-martial panel listened in obvious disgust as the recording revealed the true nature of the man they had been asked to see as a victim. "Admiral Whitman," Martinez asked after the recording concluded, "do you still maintain that you have always treated female personnel with respect and professionalism?" Whitman's response was barely audible. That recording was taken out of context. But Martinez wasn't finished. She produced a series of photographs taken during the reception at Camp Pendleton, showing Whitman's hands wandering during his conversation with Maria, capturing the exact moments when his behavior crossed from inappropriate to criminal. "Admiral," Martinez asked, pointing to a particularly clear photograph, "is this what you consider normal social interaction?" The photograph showed Whitman's hand clearly groping Maria in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. His claim that their interaction had been professional was revealed as an obvious lie. As Martinez concluded her cross-examination, Admiral Whitman sat defeated in the witness chair. His credibility had been completely destroyed, his pattern of predatory behavior exposed, and his claims of innocence revealed as carefully constructed lies. The man who entered the courtroom as a distinguished flag officer left the witness stand as an exposed sexual predator whose career was effectively over. The impact on the court-martial panel was immediate and obvious. Several members struggled to maintain their professional composure as they listened to the recording and viewed the photographic evidence. Staff Sergeant Johnson, one of the enlisted panel members, was seen shaking his head in disgust during Whitman's testimony. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley knew that his case was in serious trouble. His star witness had not only failed to convince the panel of his innocence, but had actually strengthened the defense's argument that Maria had acted appropriately in defending herself against a sexual predator.
The defense phase of the trial began with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez calling Master Sergeant James Patterson to the stand. Patterson, the 20-year Marine veteran who had witnessed the entire incident, provided devastating testimony about what he had observed during Admiral Whitman's interaction with Maria. "Ma'am," Patterson testified, his voice filled with controlled anger, "I've seen predators in action before, both in combat zones and, unfortunately, within our own ranks. Admiral Whitman was hunting Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the moment she approached him. His behavior was textbook sexual predation." Patterson described in detail how Whitman had positioned himself to block Maria's retreat, how his hands had wandered increasingly aggressively, and how Maria had clearly attempted to maintain professional distance before being forced to defend herself physically. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez showed remarkable restraint," Patterson continued. "Any Marine trained in hand-to-hand combat could have done much more damage. She used precisely the minimum force necessary to stop the assault and free herself from his grip." Under cross-examination, Lieutenant Colonel Bradley attempted to suggest that Patterson's interpretation of events was colored by his personal loyalty to Maria, but Patterson's response was unequivocal. "Sir, my loyalty is to the Corps and to the truth. What I witnessed was a sexual assault in progress, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez responded exactly as she should have." Captain Sarah Mitchell followed Patterson to the stand, providing similar testimony about what she had observed. As an officer, Mitchell's perspective carried particular weight with the court-martial panel. She testified that Maria's response had been, quote, "professionally appropriate given the circumstances," and that any Marine facing similar assault would be justified in using defensive force. Members of the panel, we train our Marines to identify threats and respond decisively. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez identified a clear threat to her person and neutralized it using appropriate defensive techniques. Her actions upheld the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. The defense then called a series of character witnesses who painted a picture of Maria as an exemplary Marine whose entire career had been marked by professional excellence and personal integrity. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, no relation, who had served as Maria's senior enlisted advisor during her deployment to Afghanistan, described her as the finest Marine I've had the privilege to serve with. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez never showed any propensity for violence except when defending herself or others. She's the Marine you want beside you in a firefight, and she's the Marine you trust to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. The most powerful testimony came from General Patricia Williams, the two-star Marine general who had mentored Maria earlier in her career. General Williams appeared via video conference from her current assignment, and her testimony carried enormous weight with both the panel and the packed courtroom. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez represents everything we strive for in the Marine Corps. Honor, courage, and commitment are not just words to her, they are principles she lives by every day.
If she felt compelled to use physical force to defend herself, then I have absolute confidence that she faced a genuine threat that left her no alternative. General Williams went on to address the broader implications of the case. We have failed our female Marines by allowing predators like Admiral Whitman to operate with impunity for decades. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez did what our system should have done years ago. She stopped a sexual predator from claiming another victim. The defense also called Dr. Jennifer Thompson, a clinical psychologist who specialized in military sexual trauma. Dr. Thompson testified about the psychological impact of sexual assault in military settings and explained why victims often felt they had no recourse through official channels. The military's hierarchical structure creates a perfect environment for sexual predators. Victims are taught from day one that questioning superior officers is tantamount to insubordination. When that superior officer is a flag-rank admiral, the power differential becomes overwhelming. Dr. Thompson's testimony helped the panel understand why previous victims of Admiral Whitman's behavior had felt unable to come forward, and why Maria's physical resistance was both necessary and appropriate. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful moment of the defense case came from Corporal Jennifer Hayes, who took the stand to describe her own encounter with Admiral Whitman earlier on the day of the incident. Hayes, visibly nervous but determined, described how Whitman had made sexually explicit comments to her and had threatened her career if she didn't comply with his demands. When I saw what he was doing to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Hayes testified through tears, I knew she was fighting for all of us. She did what I was too scared to do. The defense concluded with testimony from Agent Rebecca Thompson of NCIS, who walked the panel through her comprehensive investigation of Admiral Whitman's pattern of behavior. Agent Thompson's testimony revealed the systematic nature of Whitman's predatory conduct and the institutional failures that had allowed it to continue for so long. Admiral Whitman's behavior wasn't aberrant, it was calculated and systematic. He targeted strong, accomplished women who posed a threat to his control, and he used his rank and authority to silence his victims. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was simply the first victim who was willing and able to fight back effectively. As the defense rested its case, it was clear that they had successfully shifted the narrative from Maria as an out-of-control Marine who had assaulted a superior officer to Maria as a brave service member who had finally stood up to a serial predator.
The closing arguments phase of the court-martial represented the culmination of months of preparation and weeks of intense testimony. The packed courtroom fell silent as Lieutenant Colonel Bradley rose to deliver the prosecution's final argument to the 7-member panel. Bradley knew his case was in serious trouble, but he was determined to make one last appeal to military discipline and order. "Members of the panel," he began, "we cannot allow the actions of Admiral Whitman, however inappropriate they may have been, to excuse the serious crime that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez committed. Military discipline depends on respect for rank and authority. If we allow subordinates to physically assault superior officers based on their perception of inappropriate behavior, we undermine the very foundation of military order." Bradley argued that Maria should have reported Admiral Whitman's behavior through proper channels, rather than taking the law into her own hands. He acknowledged that the Admiral's conduct was inappropriate, but insisted that it didn't justify the serious physical injury that Maria had inflicted. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez broke a flag officer's arm, Bradley emphasized, his voice carrying conviction despite the weakness of his case. That injury will affect Admiral Whitman for the rest of his life. Whatever he said or did, it didn't warrant that level of violence. But Bradley's argument felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence that had been presented during the trial. The panel members' expressions suggested that they had already made up their minds about Admiral Whitman's credibility and character. When Lieutenant Colonel Martinez rose to deliver her closing argument, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Martinez had methodically built her case over the past weeks, and now she had the opportunity to tie it all together in a final appeal for justice. "Members of the panel," Martinez began, her voice carrying the passion of someone who truly believed in her client's innocence. "Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez is not a criminal. She is a hero. She stood up to a sexual predator when no one else would. She protected herself and potentially countless future victims when the system failed to do so. Martinez walked the panel through the evidence systematically, reminding them of Admiral Whitman's pattern of predatory behavior, the institutional failures that had protected him for decades, and the clear photographic evidence of his assaults on Maria. The prosecution asks you to ignore what Admiral Whitman was doing and focus only on Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's response. But you cannot separate her actions from the threat she faced. She was being sexually assaulted by a man who had used his rank and authority to victimize women for decades. Her response was not only justified, it was necessary. Martinez emphasized that Maria's training as a Marine had prepared her to identify and neutralize threats, and that Admiral Whitman's behavior constituted exactly the kind of threat she had been trained to resist. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez took an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Admiral Whitman made himself an enemy of everything the Marine Corps stands for when he chose to prey on the very people he was supposed to protect and lead. The defense attorney concluded with a powerful appeal to the panel's sense of justice. You have the power to send a message today, not just to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, but to every service member who has been victimized by those in positions of authority. You can tell them that the military will finally protect victims instead of predators. You can tell them that fighting back against sexual assault is not only acceptable, it's honorable. As Martinez returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent for several moments. The emotional impact of her closing argument was evident on the faces of panel members, spectators, and even court personnel. Colonel Henderson provided the panel with detailed instructions on the law and the charges against Maria. She explained the elements of assault on a superior commissioned officer, the legal standards for self-defense, and the burden of proof that the prosecution had to meet for conviction. The panel retired to deliberate at 1500 hours on a Friday afternoon. Military legal experts had predicted that deliberations could last days given the complexity of the case and its unprecedented nature. But the panel members had heard enough. After just 2 hours and 37 minutes of deliberation, the panel sent word to Colonel Henderson that they had reached a verdict. Court personnel scrambled to notify the attorneys and reassemble the packed courtroom as word spread throughout the base that a decision had been reached. Maria sat calmly at the defense table as the courtroom filled. Her family, who had maintained a constant presence throughout the trial, took their seats in the front row. Her father caught her eye and nodded encouragingly, while her mother whispered what appeared to be a prayer. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Colonel Henderson called the court to order. "Has the panel reached a verdict?" she asked. Colonel David Martinez, the senior member of the panel, stood at attention. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." "What is your verdict?" Colonel Martinez's voice carried clearly throughout the silent courtroom. "On the charge of assault on a superior commissioned officer, we find the accused, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, not guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause that Colonel Henderson made no attempt to silence. Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of uncertainty finally lift from her shoulders. Her parents embraced tearfully in the gallery, while her legal team exchanged congratulations. But the panel wasn't finished. Colonel Martinez continued, "We further find that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez acted in lawful self-defense against a sexual assault in progress and that her actions upheld the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps." The additional statement was unprecedented in military justice, but it sent a clear message about how the panel viewed both Maria's actions and Admiral Whitman's conduct. The acquittal of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez sent shockwaves through the military establishment that reverberated from the Pentagon to bases around the world. Within hours of the verdict, news organizations were broadcasting the story internationally, and social media exploded with reactions from service members, veterans, and civilians who saw Maria's case as a watershed moment in the fight against military sexual assault.
The immediate aftermath was swift and decisive. Admiral Charles Whitman, who had already been quietly reassigned to a desk job pending the trial's outcome, submitted his resignation from the Navy within 48 hours of the verdict. His resignation was immediately accepted by Navy leadership, who were eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Whitman forfeited his pension and benefits and faced potential civilian criminal charges as several of his victims came forward to file complaints with local law enforcement agencies. More significantly, the Navy announced a comprehensive review of Whitman's entire career, with a focus on identifying institutional failures that had allowed his predatory behavior to continue unchecked for decades. The review ultimately led to disciplinary action against several senior officers who had ignored or covered up complaints against Whitman, sending a clear message that enablers would be held accountable alongside perpetrators. For Maria herself, the acquittal marked not an end, but a beginning. She was immediately restored to full duty status and received a formal commendation from the Commandant of the Marine Corps for her courage in standing up to sexual assault. The commendation specifically praised her unwavering commitment to the values of honor, courage, and commitment, even in the face of significant personal risk. But perhaps more importantly, Maria became a symbol of resistance for countless other victims of military sexual assault. Her story inspired dozens of other service members to come forward with their own experiences, leading to a wave of investigations and prosecutions that fundamentally changed how the military handled sexual assault cases. The Rodriguez Standard, as it came to be known, established clear legal precedent that service members had not only the right, but the duty to defend themselves against sexual assault, regardless of rank or authority of their attacker. Military legal experts noted that the case effectively overturned decades of precedent that had prioritized military hierarchy over personal safety and dignity. 6 months after her acquittal, Maria was promoted to gunnery sergeant, a promotion that had been delayed during her legal proceedings. She chose to remain on active duty, driven by a desire to help reform the system from within. She became a vocal advocate for sexual assault prevention and response programs, speaking at military installations around the world about her experience and the importance of creating a culture where victims felt safe to report abuse. Maria's story also caught the attention of Congress, where several representatives used her case to push for comprehensive military justice reform. The Rodriguez Act, passed 18 months after her trial, mandated that all sexual assault cases in the military be handled by specially trained prosecutors rather than commanding officers, addressing one of the fundamental structural problems that had allowed predators like Admiral Whitman to escape accountability. The legislation also established new protections for service members who reported sexual assault or harassment, including provisions that prevented retaliation and ensured that victims would not be punished for defending themselves against assault. Maria was present when the president signed the Rodriguez Act into law, standing alongside other military sexual assault survivors who had fought for decades to achieve meaningful reform. The impact extended beyond the military as well. Maria's story became a rallying point for the broader #MeToo movement, demonstrating that victims of sexual assault could fight back effectively when institutions failed to protect them. She received hundreds of letters from women around the world who drew inspiration from her courage to confront their own abusers. Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Martinez, Maria's defense attorney, was promoted to colonel and appointed to head a new military legal assistance program specifically designed to support victims of sexual assault. She frequently credited Maria's case with opening her eyes to the systemic problems within military justice and inspiring her to dedicate her career to reform efforts. Agent Rebecca Thompson of NCIS received recognition for her thorough investigation of Admiral Whitman's conduct. Her work on the case led to the development of new investigative protocols for military sexual assault cases, with an emphasis on identifying patterns of predatory behavior and institutional enablement. Thompson went on to lead a specialized NCIS unit focused on military sexual assault cases. The 195 Marines who witnessed Maria's confrontation with Admiral Whitman became unofficial ambassadors for cultural change within the Corps.
Many spoke publicly about how witnessing the incident had changed their understanding of sexual assault and their commitment to preventing it. Several became instructors in sexual assault prevention programs, using Maria's story as a powerful example of courage and integrity. The broader impact on military culture was perhaps the most significant outcome of Maria's case. Her story became required reading in leadership courses throughout the military, and her actions were held up as an example of how Marines should respond when confronted with behavior that violated core values. The case sparked conversations about consent, respect, and personal responsibility that reached into every corner of military life. 5 years after the incident, Maria had been promoted to Master Sergeant and was serving as the senior enlisted advisor for a major logistics command. She had married her longtime boyfriend, a fellow Marine, and they had started a family together. Despite offers from book publishers and movie producers, she had largely remained out of the public eye, preferring to focus on her military duties and her role as a mother. But her legacy continued to grow. The Marine Corps established the Rodriguez Award for Moral Courage, presented annually to service members who demonstrated exceptional bravery in upholding core values despite personal risk. Military installations around the world displayed her photograph alongside other Medal of Honor recipients and military heroes, recognizing her contribution to the evolution of military culture. In a speech delivered at the Marine Corps Birthday Ball celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Corps, the Commandant reflected on Maria's impact. Master Sergeant Rodriguez reminded us that being a Marine means more than following orders. It means having the moral courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when it challenges authority. She embodied our values when our institution failed to protect them. Maria's story became a testament to the power of individual courage to drive institutional change. She had transformed a moment of personal crisis into a catalyst for systemic reform, proving that one person's refusal to accept injustice could change the world for countless others. As she reflected on her journey during a recent interview, Maria's words captured the essence of what her story represented. I didn't set out to be a symbol or to change the military. I just refused to let someone hurt me when I had the power to stop them. But I learned that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who comes after you. That's what being a Marine really means. Protecting others even when the threat comes from within our own ranks. Today, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, now Master Sergeant Rodriguez, continues to serve her country with the same dedication and integrity that marked her response to Admiral Whitman's assault. Her story serves as a reminder that true military honor lies not in blind obedience to authority, but in the courage to defend what's right, no matter the cost. The Admiral tried to touch her, until she broke his arm in front of 195 Marines. But that moment of physical resistance was just the beginning of a much larger battle for justice, dignity, and reform that continues to reshape military culture today. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.